Okay. Well, thank you all for joining us this morning and joining me. Again, my name is Dan Lowen. I am a safety consultant with Lockton Insurance, and we are Morgan's insurance broker. And today what we're going to talk a little bit about is getting our properties ready for the winter months and dealing with some of the hazards that are specific to winter operations. And really when we talk about, what's the goal today of our session, what would we like to accomplish, really what we're trying to do is accomplish three things. Number one, we're trying to eliminate or, at best case scenario, minimize slips and falls on ice involving our residents. Similarly, what we're trying to do is to prevent pipe freezes or any other damage that may result from severe winter weather, which in turn may result in damage to the property, i.e. ice dams, frozen pipes in the water, damage that results from that, etc. And then obviously, lastly, and arguably most importantly, is to keep our team members safe out there on the property while they're engaging in snow removal, whether that be plowing or hand shoveling, etc. So those basically what our primary goals of the session are. And what probably the best place to start, or at least a good place to start, is let's take a look at the weather. The last couple of years we've had some severe winter storms, and what you have in front of you here is the latest weather forecast from NOAA, which is the National Atmospheric and National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Agency. And that's part of the federal government that participates in and forecasts weather and monitors hurricanes, et cetera, et cetera. And in short, what we have, as you can see, is that if you look in the top right-hand corner, what we have is what's predicted is kind of wetter than average in the south, in the west, specifically central and southern California, and the east coast to the southern New England. But if we're looking at maybe we're part of the country where Morgan has more of their portfolio, which is, Great Lakes, Ohio Valley, up into New York, right, we might see drier than average, as well as warmer than average west and northern half of the U.S. temperatures as far as that's concerned, below average temperatures, southern plains and the southeast. So, I mean, by and large, if we look at that precipitation map in the lower right-hand corner, it looks like it's going to either be drier or what they call an equal chance. And what they mean by an equal chance is that it should be consistent with historical averages. So depending upon where you sit there, whether you're, in Cleveland or if you're in Rochester or in New York State somewhere, it could either be an equal chance or it could be drier as far as the forecast from a precipitation standpoint. And then if I can call your attention over to the left-hand side, the top left-hand side of the map, you kind of see what's going on from a temperature standpoint, and it really looks like there's a greater probability that temperatures might be warmer. I don't want anyone to get the wrong idea. This is just, we still will have, a cold winter. There will still be winter events. There still will be severe snowstorms. There will still be periods of bitter cold, so to speak, and significant cold spells. But this is what they're forecasting is that it may not be as bad as what we've seen historically, and certainly may not be as bad as what we've seen in the last couple of years, in particular where the bulk of the Morgan portfolio is. But I just kind of want to put it in perspective. It doesn't mean we're not going to have events. I want to emphasize that and stress that. And really what's going on, and I'm sure by now everyone has heard about the El Nino event in the Pacific, which is really warmer waters in the Pacific. And as a result of that, that's changing some of the weather patterns that we're going to see over the winter time in the United States. And also, there's been a slight shift in the Pacific jet stream, which goes obviously from west to east, and that's responsible for a significant amount of weather creation as far as pulling polar weather down. Polar temperatures down and having those polar winds dip down into the continental part of the United States. Again, we're going to see a little shift in that, which is responsible for these overall weather patterns that we have here. So with that said, let's get into some of the what I'll call the blocking and tackling of the presentation, so to speak, and talk a little bit about preventing resident slips and falls. And what I'd like to start with are some specific Morgan policies and procedures. And what you have in here starting on the top left-hand side of the slide are some specifics regarding, hey, here's what our expectations are of you out at the properties are, here's what our policies and procedures say. And really straightforward, when we're talking about hand shoveling, when do we need to get out there and shovel the property by hand? What do we need to do from that standpoint as far as staircases, sidewalks, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Really what our trigger is, at about 1.5 inches, we need to be out there on property shoveling snow, okay? So if we're looking for a general guideline, and this again is part of the policies and procedures, at 1.5 inches, we should be out there hand shoveling. As far as getting out there and plowing with our equipment, 2 to 3 inches of snowfall should be our trigger. So if you have a 1/2 inch, maybe no need to get out there and do anything, but you should inspect your property nonetheless and have some due diligence. But certainly at 4 inches, we need to be out there shoveling and also plowing. I'm going to take just a quick side second here just to make sure that I've muted all those good folks who have joined, and welcome. Okay, perfect. Okay, so getting back to, okay, here's what our triggers are. Well, when do we need to do that work? When does it need to get done by? If I call your attention to the slide, if we're talking about weekdays, which in other words means when folks are going to work and leaving the property early, main walks, stoops, roads, and main parking lots by 7 a.m., okay? That's important. We'll talk in a little bit about kind of planning that work and whatnot, what goes with that, but in order to have that work done by 7 a.m., what you need to ask yourselves, what time do I need to bring my team in order that they can get that work accomplished? And as a complement to that, ice, melt, and sand by 8 a.m. Again, the question comes down to what time do I need to have my team come in so that they can be successful in meeting those deadlines? Weekends, things shift by an hour, given the fact that folks don't rise and shine quite so early on the weekends, and you can see same type of thing, but everything is pushed an hour. Again, what am I going to do about this? How am I going to deal with it, especially on the weekend? When do I need to bring my crew in? That's a decision that needs to be made at the property level, obviously. And then since it doesn't only snow at night, what about during the daytime, right? What if it just starts snowing at 10 o'clock in the morning? What then? And there we basically have a trigger of 4:30 p.m. And what that really comes down to is, when are folks coming back to the property in large numbers? When are they returning from work? That's when we have to have that hand shoveling and that plowing done as well. Now, I know the bulk of you do your own shoveling and do your own plowing, but there may be cases where either you're using a vendor, a third-party vendor, to do that work for specifically the plowing, not necessarily the hand shoveling. And some things that I want to kind of set the stage for, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple of minutes, is, where we do have snow removal contractors, what do our relationships look like? And we'll talk about that contract in a second. From an on-call responsiveness, do we have an idea of what that additional cost would be? And then their insurance and risk transfer consideration that we have to consider at this point as well. But again, by and large, your takeaway needs to be, we do the snow removal primarily in-house, and these are our triggers, and these are our deadlines that we need to do. As far as preparing the property and preparing ourselves, what I want to do again is also kind of give you some food for thought now that we're in fall time, as far as, hey, what are we going to do about how are we going to be successful in removing this snow, and how are we going to prepare for some of these events that might not otherwise happen all the time. And what I mean by that is that first one, roof snow removal contingency. That huge snowstorm that if we have any Buffalo or Buffalo area properties that impacted us last year in the late fall, there obviously was an issue with snow loading on the roofs, right? If that's something that you have to consider given the configurations of your property, perhaps you have significant flat roofs, whatnot, that needs to be part of your pre-planning right now. What am I going to do if I need to remove snow from a snow loading standpoint on the roof? Is it something that we're going to do in-house? Are we going to vend it out? How are we going to get that done? Again, my takeaway to you is start thinking about that and figuring out what the solutions are, right? But getting back to talking about snow removal, now's the time to walk your property, okay? So, has anything changed with regard to your property that may impact your ability to clear that snow? Sidewalk damage that needs to be repaired. We have significant potholes in the parking lot that are going to impact our ability to plow that snow, etc. What does, the key type of thing is, we want to get that moisture away from the building, right? Are our roofs in good condition? Does our drainage systems operate properly, meaning our gutters in need of repair? Get that work done right now. Our downspouts pointed away from the building, et cetera, et cetera. Those are the types of things that we need to talk about. Also, similarly, start sharing with your crew where your hot spots are. And what I mean by that is, and please forgive me for this scenario, is, again, we do the bulk of the snow removal in-house. What if we have somebody new on property, right? So we have a new member of the maintenance team who's going to be helping us with this endeavor, whether they're shoveling snow or whether they're operating a vehicle with a plow, right? How do they know where our problem spots are? If we have folks on property who have been on property for years and understand kind of how the snow blows around and the weather dynamics of the property, they know where those tough areas are. They know where ice may form. They may even know where slips and falls have occurred in the past. What I encourage you to do now that you're starting to prepare for the winter months, share that information with the rest of your team. So, for example, if we know because of the configuration of the building, the way the wind blows around Building 7, I'm making this up obviously, the northwest side of Building 7, the way the wind blows is that we constantly have a buildup of snow within those first couple of days of the storm until that snow gets compact and hard, right? So that needs to be shared with the team. That's an area you really need to focus on. Or similarly, because it gets warm, it gets warm during the day, a lot of ice forms in a certain area, that type of thing. So again, ask yourself, what are my hot spots? Have I communicated that to the team? Are we prepared to deal with those? The other thing is strategy as far as where we want to push the snow, right? So what I mean by that is, there are high sides and low sides to the property. There are pieces of the property that get a lot of sun, then it kind of melts, and then by the time nighttime and the snow, the temperatures drop, the snow freezes again, and we're going to get ice formation. So, for example, if you look at that picture that I've shown here of that dumpster area, maybe not, and this is not a Morgan location, maybe not the best idea to push the snow in this area because it's going to melt during the day and it's going to freeze at night. Guess what happens at night? That's when folks throw their trash away and they're going to slip and fall in that area, right? So these are types of things of understanding the property, knowing the property well, and pre-designating where you're going to push the snow in each parking lot. One of the things that works awfully well, in particular when we're talking about new hires who may not be familiar, is I'm going to make the assumption that everybody has a property map that they show prospective residents. Use that and color-code it. So, for example, if you take that property map and you take each parking lot and maybe put a yellow mark in the area of each parking lot where the snow needs to be piled or what side of the parking lot the snow needs to be piled, is a good way of color coding and making it easy to communicate with folks. Hey, if you're the one who's plowing that lot, here's where the snow gets pushed, so that we don't push it to the high side of the lot, we push it to the low side of the lot or away from a hazard such as these dumpsters. And similarly, if there are problems in that parking lot, big potholes or a raised manhole cover or anything else like that that would be a hazard and get in the way of us doing an effective job of plowing, damage the parking lot, damage the plow, that kind of thing, mark it in red on that map as well. Again, that's an easy way to facilitate communication of when we're talking about plowing, those types of things. And that's obviously what that last point is about drains, curbs, and other hazards that you need to be aware of. If you are using a third-party vendor for snow removal, these are things that you need to share with them also. We don't want them pushing snow, for example, again, in front of the dumpsters as far as that's concerned. If indeed, again, as I just said, if you are using a snow removal contractor, what I have here is a screenshot of the vendor insurance requirements and agreements. The takeaway from this is if we're bringing a third party in to help with snow removal, they have to follow the guidelines of this vendor insurance requirement and agreement. They have to sign the agreement, and then that needs to be remitted back to corporate. And the kinds of things that document goes over is transfer liability, saying, hey, if you're going to plow the lot, we're not responsible. You as the vendor are responsible. It prescribes what kind of insurance coverage, liability coverage, for example, that the vendor needs to have, as well as what their limits of insurance. So the takeaway for this is if we're bringing someone on property for that purpose to remove snow, they too, just like any other vendor, have to sign and abide by this DIRA document. As far as what needs to be done, and I touched upon this a little bit before, as far as preparing the property, you know, we have the luxury of time right now. It hasn't snowed yet in general. I think in some areas you may have had the first snowfall. I'm out of Denver, Colorado, and we didn't get our first snowfall yet, but I'm sure it's coming. But I know some parts of New York State did already. But now is the time when we have that from the standpoint of weather is, you know, go out and walk your properties, and I covered some of these things, you know. Fill and patch cracks and holes, and specifically, it doesn't have to be big ones necessarily. It could be small ones. We don't want snow to melt or water to form into those pools and then refreeze. And when things freeze, obviously they expand, and that contributes to the cracking and to these additional trip and fall hazards, which don't necessarily have to be due to a slippery condition, but in general just due to a pothole or a deteriorating condition in the sidewalk. We talked about gutters and downspouts. Roof drainage away from buildings, and also balconies, just as an aside, and this is kind of a best practice, and that's what I'll call it, is, you know, do we have structural issues with any of our balconies, and if we get 2 feet of snow, is that going to become an issue from a snow loading standpoint? So again, you know your properties best. Is there attention that needs to be paid to those balconies? And then from a basic equipment standpoint, those of you who obviously have pickup trucks that we're using from snow removal, now's the time to service those trucks. Do the lights work? Are the windshield wipers in good condition? Does the defroster work? How about the hydraulics on the plow? You know, have you tested that and done preventative maintenance on that? Do you have basic equipment such as, you know, shovels and scrapers? Do you have ice melt, sand, et cetera, et cetera? Have you laid in those basic supplies? And have you done preventative maintenance to all the equipment, which is going to be critical? You know, you might have a snow removal. Snowblower, excuse me. You may have a snowblower. You may have an ATV with a blade on it. Those kinds of things beyond the forklift truck. Are we ready? You know, the time to start that snowblower is not the morning of that first snow. Obviously, now is the time to make sure. And then simple stuff. Do we have fuel? Right? Do we have enough fuel to get us through that first snowstorm if it is a bad snowstorm? So just some things to think about. You know, as far as you know, ice melt products and strategies and things like that. The basic company recommendation I've included down there in red, and the recommendation is to use a CMA product, which is a calcium magnesium acetate with urea product, on sidewalks, steps, stoops, and then rock salt for roadways. Let me kind of move around this slide here. Basically, the reason that you want to use that CMA product on sidewalks, steps, and stoops, I'll call your attention to the to the right hand side of the screen, kind of the middle. That calcium mag chloride pellets is the same thing as these CMA types of things. And the reason you want to use that is, number one, it's very good in low temperatures. Let me drive you guys crazy and call your attention to rock salt over on the bottom left-hand side. You know, rock salt doesn't work under 20 degrees Fahrenheit, right? So when we have the typical cold weather that I'm going to assume all of you have, during the winter months, rock salt's not effective on sidewalks and stairs, et cetera, when it gets that cold. So we want to use something that's effective in cold temperatures. That's why we want to use the CMA product, which has the same characteristics as this calcium mag chloride pellet, right? So it's good at low temperatures, right? It's good when there's snow on the ground already. Rock salt isn't so hot when there's already snow on the ground. It's less harmful to landscape, which is critically important. It's pet-friendly, okay, and that's obviously important from a resident standpoint, and it's also not corrosive to metal. And why that's important is some of you might have exterior staircases that have metal banisters. If we use rock salt on that, it's corrosive to that metal over time as the rock salt mixes with water, and then it's, you know, the metal balusters are sitting in a pool of water mixed with rock salt. That's corrosive to the metal, so over time we have an issue from the standpoint of that metal rusting out and degrading, and that can be an issue from a slip and fall standpoint because we may have a structural issue with regard to that banister. So it's not only what's going to happen during the winter, but it's what's going to happen during warmer months if that banister is no good. So basically what the recommendation is to use that product and why for sidewalk, steps, and stoops. And rock salt is fine for roadways in general because of the fact that there's a lot of surface area. It's typically not in the shade. It warms up during the day, and there's no exposure to landscape, not as much exposure to pets, and there certainly is no normal exposure to metals, those kinds of things. When I will share this presentation with everybody through the corporate office, and you can go through some of the other details about what works and what doesn't work. But again, I just want to call your attention to what our policy and procedure is. One last thing, if anybody has any brand new properties, I know there are a lot of new builds within the portfolio, you can't use any of these products with what I'll call green concrete, which is concrete that is less than a year old. You want to use specifically designed products which are geared for that green product. And if you can't, green concrete, and if you can't get your hands on those products or that's confusion, then just go with the old faithful, which is sand. So again, a word to the wise for those properties that are less than a year old where that concrete was recently poured. So getting back to something that I mentioned earlier as far as, hey, okay, if we have a deadline of 7 a.m. to do the hand shoveling, how are we going to prepare for that, right? What are we going to do on property, get our teams ready, things like that. And what I want to talk a little bit about here is kind of what that preparation looks like, from a project management standpoint, right? One of the issues with having a significant snowfall is it gets in the way of the day's work, right? Our first and our primary priority is snow removal, right? But how are we going to fit in the rest of the day's tasks? It may continue snowing throughout the day, even though we have that 7 a.m. deadline. It may continue snowing throughout the day, and how are we going to balance the two types of the two things? And what I mean by the two things is one is continued snow removal, the other is maintenance tickets, make-readies, emergencies, etc. The life goes on, and the property still has issues that still need to be dealt with as well. So what I would do is now give some thought now, again, while we have the convenience of time because we don't have a weather crisis, to look at roles and responsibilities for all team members. And what I mean by that is maybe it's the responsibility of all folks, and we're typically talking about the maintenance team here, obviously, is maybe it's, initially the responsibility of all members of the maintenance team to go out there and shovel and plow until, I'm going to make this up, until approximately 9 a.m. Then maybe one of the members of the maintenance team will then peel off and triage the maintenance tickets and make sure that those safety essential and or critical maintenance tickets get dealt with. So for example, something that's safety critical, maybe that a report has come in that a smoke detector is broken. Obviously that's not something we want to wait till the next day or the end of the shift to repair. That's something that needs to be dealt with immediately. Similarly, if someone's heat is out or broken, right? Again, that's a critical maintenance ticket. So it's really just giving some thought about, hey, how am I going to triage this work? What's going to happen? Because I am going to have this priority of the snow removal, but there will also may be maintenance tickets that have a priority as well, and some that can wait for the next day, those types of things. So that's something, again, it's all about planning. It's having discussions with the property community manager out there along with the service or maintenance lead to make sure that we're kind of hitting the issue from all sides, but that takes some pre-discussion. Other things as far as a plan of attack, what do we focus on first from a snow removal standpoint? I would argue, maybe we hit common areas and steps first and then do sidewalks. Perhaps you have a different take on things at your properties. Certainly steps need to be first, but then it kind of becomes, hey, what should we hit next? Again, those are decisions, and I know that it seems very simple and straightforward, but it needs to be communicated to your teams. You're going to spread the members of your maintenance team to all four corners of the property, so to speak. We're doing snow removal, and we just want to make sure everybody's prioritizing the same type of thing. And the next thing here on this list is, are we prepared to respond before the morning commute? And we talked a little bit about this. How are we going to meet that 7 a.m. deadline? How are we going to meet that 8 a.m. deadline? That takes somebody watching the weather every single day to say, and today is Thursday. We're going to have a snowstorm on. Saturday morning, right? How are we going to deal with that? Or is someone going to watch the weather? So at close of business tomorrow, Friday, we can talk to the maintenance teams and say, look, guys, in all likelihood, we're going to ask you to come in early on Saturday to deal with that, right? So it doesn't really make a difference what day of the week it is, but someone needs to watch the weather and then be prepared. The time to be calling your teams to come to work early is not the morning of that snowfall. Now, granted, there are times we get caught flat-footed, but if there's going to be a significant storm, I would hope that someone's watching the weather on property and we don't get flat-footed on those significant snowstorms. Team call-out to be shoveling, plowing deadlines, those kinds of things. That's more of an issue of if we do get caught off guard, do we have a means of communicating communicating with those teams, et cetera, to say, hey, this kind of caught us off guard, I need to come into work an hour early, so how are we going to communicate? And then, in the spirit of, the morning commute is, I know we have the deadlines for plowing, but are we going to go back and replow after the bulk of the community has left for work to clean out those lots? How are we going to go about it? What's our plan for this? Again, this is just from a planning standpoint, so we know what we're going to focus on. We talked a little bit about hotspots before. There's no reason to go over that again. One of the things, though, I don't want you to lose sight of is interior areas and floors at building entrances. Snow isn't necessarily the issue. It's when the snow melts and becomes pools of water. So at our primary entrances in our community, at the office, if we have outbuildings such as a laundry room, things like that, what are we doing in those areas? Entrances to buildings where we have interior walkways and staircases or elevator lobbies, et cetera, based upon the way your building is constructed or put together, is do we have adequate mats? Is somebody keeping an eye on it and mopping where we have excess moisture? Those kinds of things. Do we need to post those little yellow slip and fall plastic tents that warn of potential slip and fall hazards? So again, it's not just, what are we doing from the standpoint of, on the exterior slip and fall standpoint, how about just that wet floor hazard? The other side, I know we've talked quite a bit, and we'll continue to talk quite a bit about snow removal here, but lighting is exceptionally important when it comes to preventing slips and falls all year round. Certainly, when we have snowfall, there may be, the clouds are, we have cloud cover, we don't have moonlight. It may be extra dark in places on the property. Again, I know everyone's doing weekly lighting logs, right? But now is the time to really make sure that the lighting, one, is working, and two, is adequate, right? Where we have good illumination, we tend to not have issues from a slip and fall standpoint because folks can see the hazards, right? We talked a little bit about, what to do if we need to call in a vendor, what to do if we need to do roof snow removal. So that's kind of that resource in case of blizzard or severe storm. And one thing I want to bring up here is, it's not just the day of the storm, and we'll talk about this when we talk about snow logs, but, if it's not dry, is there still a hazard? Are we walking the property to look for ever-changing snowfall conditions day 2 after the storm, day 3, day 4, again, until that snow sort of gets packed and compacted and isn't a blowing hazard any longer? So that's something to look at. Is, hey, are we continuing to walk the property? Are we continuing to do touch-up work on the property to prevent that slip and fall hazard? While certainly not foolproof, resident awareness is another tool in the slip and fall prevention toolbox, so to speak, that we can use. If your community's put out fall-time newsletters, if you do door hangers, if you have a Facebook page that members of the community visit, that's sponsored by the property, now's the time to put up some general winter hazard warnings to say, hey, it's going to be winter time. Be careful out there from slippery conditions. Take your time. Be cautious around. We do our best. But you still need to be cautious, et cetera, et cetera. So use all the tools that are at your disposal in order to combat the issue from a slip and fall standpoint. When we talk about slips and falls and we talk about snow removal logs, we're really talking from a claims defense standpoint. And what that means is the documentation of your snow removal efforts are extremely important if we get into a situation where a resident has slipped and fell, and they, for example, might be suing us. That information that are kept on those electronic snow removal logs are really helpful in combating the claims and in helping those claims to get denied. They're also very important in also containing the cost of those claims. So, turning a $25,000 claim perhaps into a $2,000 claim. So I cannot emphasize enough the importance of that paperwork, and we'll go through briefly in a second here what that paperwork is and where you can find it on your intranet site. But again, just to borrow a phrase, right, snow removal logs, just do it, right? Make sure that you, fill out those forms online. Make sure that you're as detailed as possible. Be consistent across the property. Don't just restrict it to 50% of the buildings. You know, do it on each one of the individual buildings where you're doing snow removal. If you do have use a snow removal contractor, therefore, still fill out the snow removal logs, but document what that snow removal contractor has done. Kind of a belt and suspenders best practices I have seen where we have asked the vendor in their invoice to also reflect what they have done. So what I mean by that is in their bill, have them line item exactly, we were here between 9 and 10 a.m. on October 29th, and we plowed in front of buildings A, B, C, and D and spread sand. That kind of thing we can ask them to put in their invoice. Again, that's more documentation from a claims defense standpoint. Photos certainly don't hurt, and we'll talk about that in a second when we talk about if claims are filed. And then when I talked before a little bit about, what are we doing from a snow removal standpoint on day 2, 3, and 4 after the storm, for example, that needs to be documented in the snow removal log as well, not just what we're doing on this, what I'll call the storm day, okay? When we talk about what some specific forms, what I have here are a couple of screenshots from the intranet page, and you can kind of follow this path of where some of these forms are. Again, everything is under this snow and ice removal on the left-hand side of the screen. If you click on that link, and then that takes you to all the different documentation that exists within the system, the snow and ice removal log, and here are some different forms that reside in there where you're going to be asked to complete and document what's going on from a snow and ice removal standpoint. If indeed we have a situation where, and frankly this is for any type of claim, it's not just winter weather related, right? But if, for example, we have a resident who says, hey, a pipe froze and that damaged my precious Steinway piano because it got water on it, and then the pipes melted and they got water on it, or which would be a case of a property damage claim. Or if there's a case of bodily injury where a resident slipped and fell and say, hey, yeah, I slipped and fell on property and I broke my ankle, those kinds of things. I want to talk to you a little bit about how to respond to those claims, in particular the bodily injury ones. So again, there's 2 buckets of claims. One is property damage, which is meaning that one of the possessions of the residents or their guests got damaged. The other is bodily injury, where a resident or guest or visitor got injured on property. Okay, so those are 2 different things. And what you have here on the bottom 2/3 of the page, that accident and property damage reporting, that's within the policies and procedure manual. That goes over what the specific actions that you need to take internally in order to process those injuries and incidences and get them forwarded up to the corporate office, so then they can deal with that from a claimant standpoint. But some, I guess, word to the wise and a little bit of coaching. If a resident does come to you, and this is typically, a little bit more to the fact when it comes to a bodily injury standpoint, if a resident comes to you and says, yeah, I was walking down the staircase on building 6, and I slipped and fell, and I turned my ankle due to the snow buildup, okay? Just as far as general coaching is concerned to you there, on the maintenance side or on the community operations side, if you're the ones who are receiving these instances, never, ever, ever admit fault. It is perfectly okay to show sympathy, be sorry that they got hurt, but do not take it to that next level and say, oh yeah, that's our fault and we'll take care of it. So you can say, hey, are you okay? I am so sorry that happened to you. But again, stop short there. Don't say, I'm so sorry that happened to you. That's obviously our fault. We'll take care of everything. We'll pay all your medical bills, right? So you can show sympathy. You can show empathy. You can apologize that incident happened. But again, don't admit any fault. Don't offer to pay for anything. If someone is obviously hurt, ask them, hey, would you like me to call 911? But again, don't say, oh, I'm calling the ambulance, don't worry about it, we'll take care of everything, we'll pay for everything, right? Just offer to do that. If the injured party is ambulatory, meaning that they can move around and it's such that, or if it's a case of property damage, ask them, say, hey, can we go to your unit? Can we go to the part of the property where you felt that this happened? Can you explain to me in your own words exactly what happened? And that's where you start taking notes as far as, hey, here's what the resident said. If you're lucky enough and if you ask the resident to fill out a witness statement and a statement and they fill that out for you, that's just great. If not, you kind of write it down in your own words and then ask them, say, hey, is this an accurate representation of what you said happened, right? We only want to collect the facts. Don't include any information that is supposition on your part or opinion, just kind of the facts. Again, if they do take you to that part of the property where it happened because they can move around, take some pictures. You know, presumably the incident just occurred. I know it doesn't always happen that way, but take some pictures if you feel like those are relevant, documenting that condition. In particular, you know, if it's a water damage issue or something like that. And then ask if there are any witnesses. And if you're lucky enough, and I emphasize lucky enough, for someone to say, yeah, there were witnesses, obviously go interview those witnesses and document that. Again, when you have these kinds of incidences here, the types of forms that you're going to fill out is, first of all, if you do have a property damage claim, which is some kind of physical damage to resident's property, you're going to complete this complete the property damage report. If it's a bodily injury incident, which is a resident, a visitor, or a guest getting injured themselves, this is the form that you fill out. This is all found on the in your policies and procedure manual, as well as on your intranet. So with that said, let's shift gears here a little bit and move away from slips and fall prevention and talk a little bit about preventing pipe freeze claims and really preventing a repeat of last year. Many of you on the phone may have had instances last year due to that deep Arctic cold that we had, that there were instances of pipe freezes on your properties. And I just want to go over some basics from a prevention standpoint and go over steps that we'd like you to take this fall and as we move into the colder weather if we do have an instance of a deep freeze. Okay, first thing, know your property. If you had issues last year, let me ask you rhetorically, what have you done to address those issues? So for example, if we have sprinklered garages and we had issues that those pipes froze, that the sprinkler, and I'm talking about fire sprinklers. If we had fire sprinkler piping that froze last year, what have we done over the summer months in order to provide additional heating or additional insulation in those areas, right? So if we had an instance, what have we done to address it? If you haven't addressed it to date, now is the time to address it. The other thing is, what are we doing to communicate what I'll call our tribal knowledge? And this is basically the same thing I talked about on the slips and falls. If we have new hires on property, we need to let them know, hey, here are our troubled spots. Here are the areas that have a tendency to freeze or have frozen the last couple of years. We need to keep our eyes on these areas again this winter, right? So what are we doing from a communication standpoint? If you have a new acquisition, you purchased a property, or more typically a new build, do we need to take a hard look at that structure of what some of our susceptible areas are? We'll talk about those areas in a second. What are our plans to do about vacants, right? Vacants units can obviously be an issue from a pipe freeze standpoint, right? So do we have a good communication system set up between the service team and the leasing team so we know when units become vacant, and we know that then we can check on those, right? The key is keeping our eye on those and making sure that the heat stays on in those vacant units at a certain level, that we don't have an instance of pipe freeze. But that goes for model as well. Some of the, and I'm not 100% sure if Morgan's using some of this technology, but some of there's some new technology out there, in particular from with models, that the heat goes off when no one's, it's a motion detector activated HVAC and utility system, right? What are we doing about that during the winter months where the unit may not have any visitors for a day or two, especially Saturday afternoon into Monday if we're not open on Sunday? So do we have a mechanism of overriding that so that the heat comes on when the unit's not, when the model's not occupied during those deep freeze periods of the year? And then it's not just the residential units. If you have any retail, with your properties, and if any of those are vacant, those need to be checked on routinely as well, right? So that's where we tend to see some of the problems in the vacant units. Common areas, obviously, the ones that are most likely to have issues, exterior HVAC units. So, for example, if your property was built and And the hot water closet is outside on the balcony in a utility room. And if we have a deep freeze, what are we doing about those areas where the ambient warming in those rooms due to the HVAC unit or due to the hot water heater isn't producing enough heat, and we have a pipe freeze situation or have had one in the past? Do we need to add extra insulation? Do we need to provide temporary heat? Whatever we need to do. I know that that's a very, that's a tall task, right? When we talk about a 300-unit complex that might have that. But again, what are we doing to keep our eyes on that, right? Fire sprinkler and water supply rooms, sometimes those are outbuildings or tacked on shed type buildings that are on the exterior, especially on an older construction building. Are those conditioned and insulated properly? Again, now's the time to do that evaluation and take the extra steps that we need to do. Common laundry rooms, freestanding laundry rooms may not be very well insulated. What are we doing about heating in those areas, especially in the areas where supply lines come into the building? And then interior, where we have interior staircases, typically mid-rise kind of buildings where we have unheated or unconditioned staircases, but at the same time, we have doors to the exterior of the property that could be propped open. I've seen cases where we had fire sprinkler protected buildings, and the emergency staircase doors have been propped open to the outside. Those emergency staircase enclosures got very, very cold, which in turn froze sprinkler lines. So, do we know where our issues are? That's really the big question. Do we know where our potential issues are, and what are we going to do about monitoring those spaces? Other areas, obviously, residents who turn their heat off when they leave, garages and attic, which are protected by fire sprinkler systems, where maybe insulation isn't adequate. And then supply piping running the exterior envelope of the building. And what I mean by that is many times we have sinks right there, facing an exterior window. Well, construction at one time, for ease of construction, the supply lines for those sinks ran the exterior of the building. Well, those areas may not be very, very well insulated. So what are we going to do about that? Are we going to coach and counsel our residents to say during extreme low temperatures, hey, leave those cupboards open that are underneath your sink so that we can provide a little bit of extra heating to those plumbing supply lines, right? Those types of things. So again, when we're talking about preparing the property, we want to make sure that, heat's working properly throughout the entire structure, obviously, including common areas and outbuildings. Do we need temporary heat or extra insulation in poorly heated areas? Have we done a good enough job of draining the system? So, for example, if we have an exterior water fountain, have we drained that line so we don't have a pipe freeze and damage that piping, that type of thing? And then as far as from a general preparation standpoint, how do you know how cold it is, right? So what I'm talking about is if we do have periods of low temperature and you do have parts of the building which don't have heating, but yet we do have water lines in there or are susceptible to freezing, how do we know what that temperature is? The only way to tell is to buy a thermometer and then, hang it in that area, for 5 or 10 minutes to get an idea what the temperature in there. So every property really should have a thermometer so we know if we're getting to a critically low temperature and we need to take extra steps in some unconditioned areas, right? Again, one of the core basics are, as far as monitoring the weather. We talked about monitoring the weather and being prepared, right? We should know if we're going to get an Arctic blast that's going to last a week and what steps we need to take to prepare the property. And part of that preparing the property is preparing the residents, right? We need their cooperation to prevent pipe freezes in occupied units, especially if residents are going away for the weekend and they shut their heat off, etc. So, now's the time, if you do have full-time newsletters, or we talked a little bit about if you have Facebook pages, those kinds of things, to start talking to the residents about, hey, we're going to be in winter months. If you're going to be away from the property for a long period of time, if you're going away for a week's vacation, please, please, please don't shut your heat off. Please just turn your thermostats down to 65. Open up the cabinets under your sinks, drip your water, drip your faucets, etc. Just some of these basic skills that are basic tools that are out there. I have an example here. There's a picture that you'll all see of a kind of a freeze warning. That's something you can educate residents and use that to trigger residents to take these steps. And basically what we're saying is, hey, if you guys see these signs and you're going to be away from your units, don't shut the heat off. Leave your heat at 65, drip your faucets, open the cabinets, those types of things. Those are the critical things that you need to keep in mind, and we need to get the residents we need to really get the residents' cooperation and participation. Some residents don't like the idea of keeping their heat on because they have to pay for their heat. I know some of your properties are moving towards having thermostats that can't go lower than 59 degrees, for example. That's a foolproof way of doing it, that the residents can't shut their thermostats off completely. They can only turn them down to 59, et cetera. So, enough said about preventing pipe freezes. For the last 5 minutes here or so, what I'd like to do is to go over some basics from an employee safety standpoint, from a work comp injury prevention standpoint, from the human standpoint as far as preventing injury. And I won't go through all of these next couple of slides in detail again because you'll be sent these, but I would like to recommend that you use the content for for a monthly safety meeting, or use this just for general safety preparedness from your team standpoint. So what you have here is just some basics. You know, it's not only residents who can slip and fall, it's members of the team, and it's not only when we're doing snow removal, it could be part of the leasing staff when they're out on property showing units. So here what we have are just some basics from a safety prevention standpoint to prevent slips and falls and whatnot. And again, I won't go through all of these, but again, these are just some basics and some basic safety tips. So again, I encourage you to go over these with your team, maybe post some of these in a common area on property where you post other safety information, et cetera. Again, these are just general helpful hints. Similarly, you know, these are helpful hints from the team out there doing snow removal. You know, we want the team to come prepared to do snow removal, right? So part of that pre-planning out in the fall is to let your maintenance teams know, hey, when we're going to do snow removal, it's going to be cold. You need the right jacket. You need the right snow boots. You know, try to choose some footwear that has a slip-resistant sole, because you're going to spend a good part of the morning doing snow removal several times this year, or more than several times this year. So again, it's come prepared to work with the right equipment. If you guys may be using or entertaining the idea of using some of these slip-resistant traction devices, that's that picture there in the middle of the page on the bottom. These are these little booties that go over shoes and have either little metal gnarls in them, or some are made out of kind of a wire mesh, those kinds of things. Those are extremely helpful outside in snowy, icy areas. Once you're inside in the maintenance shop or on a dry sidewalk, they're very hazardous. So if indeed you guys do make the decision to use these, coach your teams, take them off if you're in a dry area, or if you're inside the building, or an area that doesn't have a buildup of ice or snow, because then they can actually have an opposite effect. Just something to remain aware of. On this next slide here, again, this is intended as a review for your teams. I won't go through it. Just some basic things as far as from a snow removal standpoint. Snow removal, as we all know, can be extremely physically demanding. Overexertion is an issue. Folks who may not be in the best physical condition, we're putting a great strain on their body. From a lifting standpoint, this can be a standpoint as far as back injuries are concerned as well. So again, here are just these are some basic tips that you can go over with your team from a general safety standpoint, in particular due to the hazards associated with shoveling. And then here on this last slide, what we have here is information as far as, you know, some basic things from a safety equipment standpoint. If we're using snow blowers, you know, some of those key takeaways are obviously, you know, this is a gas-fired piece of equipment. We don't want to do any fueling indoors. If we need to do refueling, stress with your teams to refuel outside. That auger and chute are extremely dangerous, and that chute can get clogged from time to time if we have a heavy, wet snow. So we really want to emphasize and remind our teams, hey, if you have to clean out that chute, number one, shut the engine off. Number two, disable the spark plug connector. And number three, use a tool. You know, every one of those snow blowers comes with a kind of, it almost looks like a plastic stick to clear those jams, right? So we never want to put our hand in harm's way. We never want to put it into that chute. We never want to put it into that auger. Snow plow, we talked about that, but obviously vehicle preventative maintenance, making sure that we can, the windows are clear and free of excess snow. Strobes are operational. I cannot emphasize enough, use extreme caution, especially when backing. There's a tendency, especially at night and when we're in a heavy kind of plowing, I'll call it the plowing zone, right, of going back and forth in a parking lot, to not be as attentive when we're backing. You have to be extremely attentive when backing, and in particular, watch your speeds when you're backing, no excessive speeds. And then if we have any ATVs where we have a mounted blade, obviously dress for the weather, wear a helmet. That's a motorized vehicle like a motorcycle. We want to protect ourselves. And again, no excess speed. What I'd like to do now is very, very quickly, I'm going to shut off the recording